Hello and welcome to our Wednesday meditations from Grace Lutheran Church, Mendham, New Jersey. I am Pastor Tim Wengert, the interim preacher for this congregation, and we thought that in the midst of all of these trials that we're facing now, not just as a country, but throughout the world with this coronavirus, that it would be good to have meditations that could take you through the rest of the week. And it occurred to me that one of the things that we could talk about that would be most helpful for folks is prayer. Because it's crises like this, I think, that drive us all to pray far more fervently. And it reminds me of something that happened to my late wife as she had terminal cancer. And a Christian magazine came to our house. It had on the cover, it said, 10 ways to improve your prayer life. She threw it down on the table and said, I know how to improve your prayer life. Get cancer. Well, of course, she didn't want anyone to have cancer, but she did realize that, in fact, and I think we all do, that in those moments of crisis is when we pray the most. And sometimes preachers are in the habit of blaming people for praying all of a sudden when there's a crisis, but we really follow the example of St. Peter, who when he's walking on the water and starts to sink, he prays mighty hard, Lord, save me. And we're in the same kind of, we have that same sinking feeling, I think, these days. I'm going to start today, I'm going to look at the Lord's Prayer as kind of a model for prayer, but unlike I would normally do, I'm going to start not with the first petition or with the introduction. We'll get to that in a later week. I'm rather going to start with the fourth petition. That is, give us this day our daily bread, or give us today our daily bread. And I start with that one because of a line from a hymn by Martin Luther that kept running through my head this past week, and I couldn't quite remember where it was, and then it struck me. It is in Martin Luther's hymn on the Lord's Prayer, the fourth petition. So we'll get to Luther's hymn in just a moment. Martin Luther loved the Lord's Prayer, and more often than you might imagine, he preached on the Lord's Prayer for his congregation. He referred to the Lord's Prayer, and then he also wrote things on the Lord's Prayer, explaining it to his people. The most famous thing that he wrote is the explanation to the Lord's Prayer in the Small Catechism. So here's what he says about the fourth petition. Give us today our daily bread. Well, what is this? Luther responds, in fact, God gives daily bread without our prayer, even to all evil people. But we ask in this prayer that God cause us to recognize what our daily bread is and to receive it with thanksgiving. My brother's a retired professor of forestry, was at the University of Wisconsin, and just before he retired many years ago, a colleague came to him and asked, knowing that my brother was a good churchgoer and a believer, asked him a theological question. Well, does God hear every prayer or only the prayers of good people? And to that, my brother answered with what he had memorized as a child, namely this explanation of Martin Luther's, where he said to this concerned person, no, God gives, answers our prayer and hears our prayer, even the prayers of all evil people. So there it is. God gives daily bread without our prayer, even to all evil people. That really is a bit of relief, because we too are sinners. And therefore, we must not imagine that God doesn't hear our prayers because somehow we're too sinful. One time at the table, Martin Luther, after they ate their dinner meal, the students would regale him with questions, and they would take notes on his answers, and that became a huge, thick book of table talk from the 1530s and 40s. And one time, one of his students, a fellow by the name of Johannes Schlagenhaufen, says, Martin Luther, I cannot pray because I'm such a sinner. And Luther responds, Schlagenhaufen, I pray because I'm a sinner. God gives daily bread to all. God answers our prayers, whether we're sinners or not. But then Luther goes on in that same explanation in the Small Catechism to answer the question, what does daily bread mean? He says, everything included in the necessities and nourishment for our bodies. And then he gives a list, such as food, drink, clothing, shoes, house, farm, fields, livestock, money, property, an upright spouse, upright children, upright members of the household, upright and faithful rulers, good government, good weather, peace, health, decency, honor, good friends, faithful neighbors, and the like. So there you have etc. at the end. But basically, everything that is involved in this life, we are praying for when we say, give us today our daily bread. And the list is really quite something, and it matches Luther's own experience. His wife had bought a farm for him so they could feed all the people that came to the table. He had livestock, and there were chickens running around in the backyard and all of that kind of thing. Our list would be somewhat different. But certainly everything that we need for this life are the things that we pray for when we pray, give us this day, or give us today our daily bread. In the 1530s, so about 10 years after he'd written the Small Catechism, Martin Luther wrote a hymned version of the Lord's Prayer. And this is what he says, or what he wrote then, for the fourth petition, give us today our daily bread. And you'll see why it was that this particular prayer was in my, or hymn was in my head this past week. Here's what he says as we're praying to God. Give us today our daily bread. Let everyone be clothed and fed. In plague and famine, war and strife, preserve from all that threatens life, that all the world may live in peace, that greed be gone, and love increase. It was that word plague that reminded me Luther also faced plagues, in fact, even wrote a little tract whether one should flee from a deadly plague, and instructing really the people that were in charge of government and the church needed to stay with the people that were dying, and the others could leave, just that they shouldn't behave in such a way as they would threaten other people's lives by their behavior. But that word plague now has a new meaning for me, having really never lived through anything like this before. That when we pray for daily bread, we're also praying these words, in plague and famine, war and strife, preserve from all that threatens life. I hope that your day and your week is filled with the daily bread of our existence. May God grant it so. Amen.